The Blade movies were the first real attempt at making a major motion picture with a Marvel character. That is, of course, if we're excluding the OG, Howard the Duck. Long before there was an on-screen Spider-Man, a live-action X-Men, or even a short-lived Daredevil, there was a big-screen Blade. These movies are where it all began, and what a beginning that was. Blade was badass personified, a stoic one-line spewing action hero with fangs, a daywalker who knew how to handle a katana, as well as everything else it seems. Despite not being a people person, and not entirely being a person, he was beloved by audiences at the time. These movies were nothing short of entertaining. They were schlocky fun that took themselves just seriously enough. They could convey a threat and have meaningful moments, but they were also doing things like this. They're chock full of action sequences that felt more like a means of showing off rather than showing a story, extended fight scenes with kung fu vampires, samurai sword fights between very obvious stunt doubles, one-liners that go hard even when they probably should have gone home,
Some motherfucker always trying to ice skate uphill,
and special effects that didn't feel all that special. Yeah, some of these are really bad. Even for the time they came out, I don't think these movies were exactly visually impressive. And it might sound like I'm ragging on these films, but in all honesty, I find it incredibly endearing. The Blade flicks felt like bad B-movies on an A-movie budget, and that's kind of its charm. Sure, it was style over substance, but at least the style was in style. It's definitely a product of its time. But having said that, it also carries the influence of times past, with the first film especially feeling inspired by 80s action movies. It should also be stated that Blade broke new ground, as these movies were some of the first ever R-rated comic book films. And while they could be corny, they certainly weren't campy. Blade was a much darker take on a character from the comics that the movie-making industry ever saw at the time. The movies were well cast, with talented people who knew what it was that they were a part of, and knew exactly how to play it up. Though that was a revolving cast, as the only two mainstays in reoccurring roles were the titular character and his trainer, Blade and Whistler. Wesley Snipes in particular was the highlight of every installment. Well, almost every installment. We'll get there. Chris Christopherson worked wonders as Whistler, the raspy old man with sage advice and a knowledge for hunting vampires, Blade's only friend and father figure. Aside from those two, the cast of characters changed with each new entry, though this was done in a way that made sense for the story. Stephen Dorff acts as Deacon Frost, the first movie's big bad. And while the character is a pretty generic by-the-numbers bad guy, the guy's pretty much perfected the part. He just radiates douchebag energy. His awfulness is only furthered by the company he keeps, as Donald Loge plays his obnoxious oafish underling Quinn. Blade 2 does the unthinkable by giving Blade a team to work with, bringing in a young Norman Reedus to act as an ally to the titular character. But it's pretty obvious he's set up to betray Blade, and he very unsurprisingly lives down to expectations. A swerve that was so phoned in that Blade was able to answer the call. The team he's on also sees Ron Perlman act as his rival, and seeing the two go back and forth in mini banter, but more importantly get one over on each other, is highly entertaining. The third movie brings in Ryan Reynolds, for what was his first, and far from his last, comic book movie. He's doing his whole Ryan Reynolds shtick the whole time. This was like him auditioning for Deadpool before he ever auditioned for Deadpool.
Which means the fat lady should be singing right about now.
This is awkward. Do you have a cell phone?
They call me the Merc with the Mouth.
These are just some of the characters that come to mind. I'm actually leaving a whole lot out right now. But my point here being, if these movies did anything right, it was finding the right people for the right parts. Even more minor roles are pretty memorable, all things considered. Now, having said that, these movies weren't without cinema sins. The movies in this trilogy feel very disjointed from each other, which is fine for a series. I don't mind if every installment is a brand new adventure, with only the characters and the name remaining the same. I mean, that's fine, that's an approach. But there were decisions made in this trilogy that definitely weren't thought out, and weren't thought of after the fact. In the first film, Blade's mentor is left with life-ending injuries. Blade gives his only friend his gun to finish the job off on his own terms. We don't actually see what happens, but a gunshot is heard, and it's clear that Whistler has chosen to take his own life rather than have his life taken from him. It's a pretty impactful scene, and a painful goodbye to an integral character in the plot and in Blade's life. But then the next installment comes along and completely retcons this moment, acting as if Whistler wasn't left for dead, but was bitten and left to turn. It's a pretty blatant attempt at rewriting history, and a pretty poor way of doing so, especially when you're neglecting the fact that the vampires not biting Whistler was actually a spoken plot point.
Bite me and get it over with.
I ain't gonna bite you.
The second movie completely undercuts that moment from the last movie and brings him back. It's not even like his return is a reveal or an arc that's explored. It's not like his mentor is made into the next big bad and Blade has to take down the only person he's ever loved. That could be something. This is not that. Following the opening credits, Blade saves his friend and cures his vampirism.
Move on, let's move on.
Blade fixing his teacher's ailment is quickly glossed over, and the whole ordeal feels like a cheap way of tying up a loose end just to return to the status quo. And after bringing the old man back for the second installment, they then killed him off again for a second and final time in the third. Because I guess that's just what his character does. He dies. That's his thing. There's also plenty of cases of contradicting continuity. In the first movie, Blade suggests that he can detect vampires.
They're vampires.
How can you tell?
By the way they move, the way they smell.
Except he's been caught off guard by them on multiple occasions in the follow-up films, including one occasion where he couldn't properly identify a vampire, mistaking a human with fake fangs for one.
Staked you with silver. Why aren't you ash?
Why aren't you smarter? Not a vampire.
Blade 2 introduces this species known as Reapers. They're essentially what would happen if vampires had vampires. These creatures prey upon Nightwalkers and humans alike. They're also equipped with predator mouth for some reason. Which, if I'm being honest, I actually thought was kind of cool. They're completely different species. Except actually they're not. They're proven to be vampires who've been experimented on. But when the next installment came out, but then the big bad of the Blade Trinity is maybe the most famous vampire, Dracula, who is also equipped with predator mouth for some reason. It's originally stated that Whistler pretty much raised Blade, finding him in his early teens wandering and feeling confused. So he took him in, gave him a home, and trained him well. Whistler talks about once having a family who seemingly passed away from a vampire attack. Due to their horrific histories with their families, Blade became a surrogate son to Whistler, and Whistler became the father that Blade never had. Even though Blade actually does have a dad according to the Blade series that's tied to this, but we'll get there eventually. But that's not even the canon error that I'm talking about here. It was made pretty clear that Whistler helped raise Blade. The two were always together on a mission. They spent a good amount of time around each other. But then all of a sudden in Blade Trinity, Whistler has a previously unmentioned daughter who he's apparently been training for years. Privately. Which means that he was going back and forth between working with Blade and also passing the torch to Abigail, and their training sessions never intersected, he trained them separately. I don't know, it seems a little weird that Whistler wouldn't let his pseudo-son know about his actual daughter. Also, he was going back and forth secretly training two vampire hunters, all while he had cancer. The movies introduced the concept of familiars. Humans who serve under vampires and sport markings of their allegiance. But then for some reason, some vampires also have those markings now too? Don't really know why. Whistler makes a big deal about Blade killing humans in the final installment. But he's killed humans with no repercussions in the first two films. No one's ever made a big deal of it back then. It's like when one movie sets up the rules to this universe, the next one would start off by breaking them. And sure, there's a lot of plot contradictions, but the last film has a shot-to-shot continuity issue. It happens often, but I'm just gonna give you my favorite here. In one scene, a baby is stolen from her mother, and the baby not only switches back and forth between being a doll and being a real child, but it also switches its race. I watched this scene back 1,000,000 times as a kid, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. And I would learn later in life that I was not, but everybody making this movie was. Though to be fair, I don't think most people watch the Blade movies for engaging and consistent storytelling. They watch them because Blade was cool and he did cool things. I know that's why I watched them as a kid. I personally can't stand when a story steps on its own toes, and as much as everything I just said bothers me, I still loved this franchise. It was hard not to. So where did it all truly go wrong? When did this series die? What was it that happened? Blade Trinity happened. And actually, it's surprising that it did. Not one single person a part of that project has anything positive to say about it.
Here's what I'll say about Blade Trinity. If you just sit and watch Blade Trinity, it's a D-. But if you know what they went through to get that movie made, it is an A+.
Would you consider doing a fourth Blade movie? Would you be interested to do another one, to be back as Hannibal King, or...?
The third part of Blade, which you directed.
Yes, worst experience of my professional career.
The making of Blade Trinity was notoriously troubled. It's actually historic how bad the behind the scenes was. It's been reported that Wesley Snipes was in the midst of a mental breakdown when making the movie. And because of that, he's actually not in a lot of it. Blade appears a lot less in this film than he did in the first two. And Wesley Snipes appears even less. Most of his work was shot with his stunt double in place, with Snipes only coming in for close-ups and necessary shots of his character. Snipes stayed away from the rest of the cast and eventually refused to speak to the director. Him and his co-stars would only communicate with post-it notes that Snipes signed Blade. He also refused to shoot a lot of scenes, which led to Ryan Reynolds getting more lines and having more of a presence in the titular character's absence. When Wesley did show up for a shoot, he still refused to do as directed. At the end, there's a scene where Blade's thought to be dead, and then he opens his eyes for a last-minute jump scare. A simple shot, right? Well, it should have been. Except the actor refused to open his eyes in that shot, causing the studio to have to CGI his eyes open at the end. He refused to open his eyes in a shot. The little behind-the-scenes footage that was released rarely included Snipes, and when he was there, he looked like he'd like to be anywhere else. The star didn't like his colleagues, having whatever the exact opposite of a soft spot is for Ryan Reynolds, mostly due to his sense of humor and constant sarcasm.
I don't like you. You never did.
But not only did he not like the new cast, he decided he didn't really like the old writer. The leading man on one occasion would lunge at the director, but Snipes wasn't the only one unhappy with the new creative direction. Chris Christopherson also questioned director David S. Goyer on a lot of the decisions he made, voicing his displeasure with the addition of several new major characters and the subtraction of one, his. No one on set was happy. Things got so bad that a pitch was made to spin off the movies away from Blade and to the Night Stalkers, a decision that thankfully would never be followed up on, as this movie effectively killed the franchise, put the stake right through its heart. The disaster that went on behind the scenes bled through on screen. The final product feels a lot like a last-ditch effort at cobbling together a movie with whatever footage they could work around, because that's exactly what it was. Snipes feels very dissociated. He's always been stoic and stone-faced as Blade, but he's never felt quite this disinterested. I think this mostly felt in line with the character, but it's still pretty excessive here comparatively. A lot of his line readings feel like he's literally just reading the lines. It sounds a lot less like an actor putting on a performance, and much more like someone reading a script aloud. So I won't say that Blade feels out of character in the movie, he just doesn't feel very present in the movie. And because of that, Blade Trinity suffers from a lack of its titular character. It's a Blade movie, but Blade's barely in it, and he has the least amount of screen time and dialogue than he's ever had in any of the Blade films. A lot of the time people complain that the movie tried to introduce too many new characters, but so did the last one, and the last one is light. Like I said before, each installment centered around a new cast of characters, plus Blade and Whistler. I think the major issue with this installment isn't that there were too many characters, it's that too many characters were used in favor of the series staples. Whistler's killed off very early on in this movie's run, in favor of showcasing a bunch of never-before-seen or heard-of characters. I don't think any of them were particularly bad additions. I think the problem is that they came at the subtraction of one of the main stars. Blade Trinity has some cool concepts, but it fails in every attempt at executing them. It's trying to do some big things, but it doesn't have the means of pulling them off. Sometimes they mention what should be major plot points, but then they're just moved on from in passing. One minute we're shown the vampires harvesting humans, and then that plot point is quickly solved 2 minutes later, because it's on to the next thing. That alone could have been an entire movie's premise, and here it's a forgettable plot point. Speaking of premises, this movie's main plot should have guaranteed success. The greatest vampire hunter of the time going up against the greatest vampire of all time. Blade vs. Dracula should have been a license to print money. Except Dracula, or as he's known in this version of events, Drake.
Yeah, Drake! Drake!
Also barely gets any screen time, and his actor doesn't deliver. He doesn't make much of an impression, which is always negative in a big bad, but it's especially disappointing when it's the big bad. The character's indifferent to aiding other vampires in taking down the Daywalker, but he does so anyway, so he's just acting with no motivation, which is what everyone not named Ryan Reynolds was doing on the set of this film anyway. The whole thing lacked a build-up and felt mostly pointless. Although I will say this of this movie, Trinity is easily the worst of the trilogy. It's got the least amount of Blade, and I give the least amount of fucks about it. But I don't think it deserves to be seen as one of the worst superhero movies of all time. I sort of think that the behind-the-scenes lore has given it that legacy. People rag on this movie specifically for its goofiness and attempts at dark and edginess, but the first two films were filled with the exact same thing. You can't dunk on this one for that. This is very much still in that nature. It's just not of that quality. All things considered, yes, this is absolutely the day this series declined and the day that it died. But I don't think it was as bad as a lot of people claim that it was. It's not great, or even good really, but it's alright. You know, if you got nothing else to watch, it's fine. It's got some genuinely good moments in it, and plenty of genuinely so bad they're good moments in it. So in spite of itself, I will say that I find it entertaining. I think sometimes a character comes along that eclipses the actual brand that it's a part of. And for me, that was Blade. I'm just gonna say it, the Blade character is more memorable than the actual movies are. I think it's just that Wesley Snipes was so good as the character that audiences wanted to see more of him as that. And everything else was just a second thought if it was thought of at all. It's like Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow. You know, the movies aren't always great, but he is. I feel very similarly about Blade. He was always on the cusp of having that one good story, but he never quite got there. Nevertheless, he was always great. Well, almost always. Anyway, with all that being said, if you like this video and would maybe be interested in seeing me explore the follow-up show that I actually didn't know was attached to this until researching this video, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"Vampires are real."
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.